The first thing my stepmother said when she saw me walk into the reading of my father's will was, "You have a lot of nerve showing up in that uniform." I was still in my scrubs. I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift at Mercy General. I hadn't even had time to change my shoes. There was a coffee stain on my left sleeve from the vending machine on the third floor, and my hair was pulled back in the kind of bun that only holds together through sheer stubbornness. I had driven 4 hours from Charlotte to Asheville with the windows down because the air conditioning in my car had been broken since March. And I had been putting off fixing it the way you put off things when you were 29 years old, and paying off student loans and picking up extra weekend shifts so you don't have to think too hard about anything. I walked into the law office of Whitmore and Associates on a Tuesday afternoon, looking like exactly what I was, a nurse who had not slept enough and had driven too far. And my stepmother looked at me like I was something the cat had dragged across her imported marble foyer. Her name was Sylvia. She had been married to my father for 11 years, which was 3 years longer than my parents had been together before my mother died. She wore her silver hair in a chignon and owned 4 properties and had strong opinions about window treatments and about me. My half-brother Bryce sat beside her. He was 26, soft-handed, freshly pressed. He had my father's jaw and Sylvia's taste in watches. He didn't look up when I came in. I sat down across from them and folded my hands in my lap and waited. The attorney, a thin man named Mr. Aldridge, read the will in a voice like a fax machine. When he got to my name, Sylvia's posture changed, stiffened, like she already knew what was coming and had already built a wall around it. My father had left me a piece of land, 42 acres in the western North Carolina mountains, outside a small town called Brevard. It was raw land, heavily wooded, with a creek running through it. It had been in his family for 3 generations. My grandfather had grown up on that land. My father had spent his summers there as a boy. He had taken me there twice when I was little, before my mother got sick, before everything changed. The will stated clearly that the land was to pass to me outright, no conditions attached. Sylvia waited until Mr. Aldridge had finished speaking. Then she said, without looking at me, "That land is the heart of what Denton planned to develop. You know that. He told you that." I did not know that. My father had not spoken to me in 14 months. "He changed his mind," Bryce said quietly, still not looking up. "Before he died, he changed his mind. He wanted her to have it." Sylvia turned to him with an expression I recognized, the kind of look that ends conversations. "He was not well," she said. "He was not thinking clearly. We all know that." And then she looked at me, directly, for the first time since I had walked in. "We'll be contesting this," she said. "I want you to understand that." I looked back at her for a long moment. Then I said, "I understand." And I meant it in a different way than she intended. I did not cry in that office. I had learned a long time ago to save my tears for places where they would not be used against me. The drive back to Charlotte felt longer than it actually was. I stopped at a gas station outside of Hendersonville and sat in the parking lot with a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels I didn't really want, and I called my best friend, Yvonne. She answered on the second ring, like she always does. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cass." She calls me that. My real name is Cassidy, which is my mother's maiden name, which is the kind of thing my father did when he was still the man I believed him to be. "Cass, you need a lawyer." I told her I couldn't afford a lawyer. She told me I couldn't afford not to have one. She was right, the way Yvonne is always right, in that way that costs you something. I have been a nurse for 6 years. I work in the cardiac step-down unit at Mercy General in Charlotte, North Carolina. I chose nursing because of my mother. She had a bad heart from the time I was 4 years old, and I spent so much of my childhood watching nurses care for her, watching the way they moved through her room with this particular kind of calm efficiency, this knowledge of exactly what to do and when to do it and how to explain it in a way that made my mother less afraid, that I thought, that is what I want to be. I want to be the person in the room who knows what to do. My mother died when I was 13, heart failure, the summer before 8th grade. My father was wrecked by it. I remember that version of him, the raw grief version, the one who couldn't look at me for weeks because I had her eyes and her stubborn streak and her particular way of laughing at things that weren't technically funny. He was wrecked and I was wrecked, and we were wrecked together for about 2 years before Sylvia arrived. She was a real estate developer. She had her own money, her own company, her own children from a previous marriage. She did not need my father's money. What she needed, I eventually understood, was my father's name and his contacts and the particular old money credibility that came from being married to a Hargrove of Asheville. My father's family had roots in western North Carolina going back 4 generations. The Hargrove name opened certain doors. Sylvia was very interested in doors. She moved in when I was 15. Bryce came with her, a sullen 13-year-old who had lost his own father 2 years prior and was not interested in a new family any more than I was. I don't blame Bryce for most of what happened. He was a kid being steered by a woman who moved through the world like a project manager, always optimizing, always looking for leverage. What I blame him for is specific, and I'll get to it. When I was 17, I applied for a nursing scholarship through a program at Mission Hospital in Asheville. It was a competitive scholarship, full tuition plus a living stipend, and I worked on that application for 3 months. My father's name was on one of the reference letters. I didn't know until years later that the letter he submitted said I was academically inconsistent and emotionally volatile, and that he had concerns about my ability to handle the demands of clinical work. I found out because a program administrator I had befriended told me, after I had already gotten my RN license, already been working for 2 years, already proved whatever needed proving. She told me over coffee that she'd always thought it was strange, that letter, that it didn't match anything else in my file. I didn't call my father when I found out. I sat with it for a week, and then I decided that some knowledge is just something you have to carry. You put it in a box and you carry it. You don't have to open the box every day. But I knew what was in the box. My father and I had a relationship for the years after I left for college that I can only describe as logistical. He called on birthdays. I came home for Christmas for 3 years and then stopped when Sylvia began seating me at the table farthest from the kitchen, next to Bryce's college friends, people who didn't know me and didn't ask. I started spending Christmas with Yvonne's family in Raleigh, her big, loud, extended family who made too much food and argued about football, and it was so much better that I eventually stopped pretending otherwise. My father didn't ask why I stopped coming home. That told me something. When he got sick 18 months before he died, it was Bryce who called me, not Sylvia. Bryce, and his voice was different than I expected. Quieter. Younger somehow. "He's asking about you," Bryce said. "I thought you should know." I went to Asheville that weekend. My father was in the early stages of a particularly aggressive form of lymphoma, and he had lost weight in that way that changes a person's face, that makes the bones more visible, that makes them suddenly look like they are already practicing for something. He was sitting in the sunroom when I arrived, and when I came in, he looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "You look like your mother." I sat with him for 4 hours that day. We didn't talk about the scholarship letter. We didn't talk about the Christmases. We talked about small things. A documentary he had watched about bird migration, the way the rhododendrons had bloomed earlier than usual that year, a fishing trip he had taken once with my grandfather to the creek on the Brevard land, when he was 8 years old and the water was so cold it felt like being held by something ancient. I drove back to Charlotte that night with the windows down even though it was October. And I thought about the creek. I thought about standing in it when I was 5 years old, my father's hand on my shoulder. The sound of water over rocks, the particular green of the light through the trees. I visited twice more over the following months. The third time he was bedridden, he held my hand at one point, not saying anything, just holding it. His grip was weaker than I expected. I stayed until Sylvia came home from a meeting and found me in his room, and the temperature of her presence was so cold and so pointed that I understood I was meant to leave, so I left. He didn't need 6 weeks later. I was not called until it was over. The contest of the will began with a letter. It arrived in my apartment in Charlotte 3 weeks after the reading, on law firm letterhead 12 pages long, alleging that my father had lacked testamentary capacity at the time of signing due to his illness and the medications he was taking, and that the bequest to me represented undue influence by a third party, specifically Yvonne, who had apparently been accused of manipulating a vulnerable man's emotional state. Yvonne, who had never met my father. Yvonne, who I had mentioned once in passing during one of my visits, who had sent him a get well card because that is the kind of person she is. I sat on my kitchen floor with those 12 pages and read them twice. Then I folded them carefully and put them back in the envelope and called the number Yvonne had gotten me. Harlan Fletcher, veterans advocacy attorney, who had apparently pivoted his practice towards civil estate disputes involving what he called targeted inheritance fraud. Mr. Fletcher was not what I expected. He was in his early 60s, compact, wearing a cardigan, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. His office in Charlotte was on the second floor of a building that also contained a tax preparer and a yoga studio. He asked me to tell him everything, so I did, including the scholarship letter which he asked me to repeat. "They wrote that," he said. "Your father." "I believe so." He looked at me over the reading glasses. "Ms. Hargrove." He used my father's name, not out of carelessness, but because he had asked me at the beginning which name I wanted him to use, and I had said Hargrove, because that land had belonged to Hargroves for 3 generations, and I was still one of them, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. "Has anyone told you about your father's estate attorney?" I said no. He slid a folder across the desk. "Your father retained a separate attorney in Brevard for the revision of this will. This is not the same firm Sylvia uses. He drove himself to that office 8 months ago and had the document prepared independently, witnessed by 2 people who have no connection to the family. He was examined by his primary care physician the week prior and declared mentally competent." I felt something shift in my chest, not relief, something more complicated. "They know this," Fletcher said, "which means what they're filing is not a good faith challenge, it's a pressure campaign. They're betting you can't afford to fight it." I thought about the 4-hour drive, the coffee stain on my sleeve, the broken air conditioning I had been putting off fixing. "Can I?" I asked. He closed the folder. "With the right documentation, yes. But I need everything you have. Every email, every voicemail, every visit log. And I need to know if there's anyone who witnessed your relationship with your father in those final months." There was someone. Her name was Dina, which I know is in the list of names already used, so let me be precise. Her full name was Dina Park, different person entirely, the hospice intake coordinator who had met with my father during his last hospitalization, a woman in her 50s with a calm voice and a habit of writing everything down. She had been present during one of my visits, when my father, unprompted, had told a story about the Brevard land, about how his grandfather had built a small cabin there by hand, and how the family had always intended to keep it, how he had made a mistake in letting things drift, in letting other people's plans become the plan. Dina had written it in her intake notes. She had written it because that was her job, because she documented everything, and those notes were in his medical file. Fletcher located them within 2 weeks. The morning of the hearing, I wore my good blazer over a plain white shirt. I had taken 2 days off work. Yvonne drove up from Raleigh and sat in the back of the courtroom and didn't say a word, just sat there, which was exactly what I needed. Mr. the Mine, Aldridge, was present on behalf of Sylvia's interests. Bryce sat beside Sylvia, his hands folded, his expression carefully neutral. Sylvia's attorney, a man named Prescott who wore pocket squares and smelled like very expensive aftershave, opened by presenting a psychological evaluation, suggesting that my father's judgment had been compromised in the final year of his life by a combination of grief, pain medication, and what the evaluation called emotional enmeshment with an estranged child motivated by guilt. He used those words, emotional enmeshment, estranged child, guilt. I looked at my hands. I kept them flat on the table. What happened next I did not expect, even though Fletcher had told me it was possible. The door opened. She came in quietly, the way people do when they have not been in a courtroom before and are uncertain of the protocol. She was in her early 60s, wearing a cardigan, her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She carried a manila folder that she held against her chest like it was something she didn't want to set down. It was Dr. Patricia Wendell, my father's oncologist. She had reached out to Fletcher independently. He had not asked her to come. She had, as she told the judge in a steady and unhurried voice, treated my father for 14 months and had documented in his file, beginning 18 months before his death, a series of conversations with him about his estate and his intentions. He had, she said, been remarkably consistent. He had spoken about the Brevard land, specifically. He had spoken about his daughter. He had asked her once, during a routine appointment, whether she thought it was too late to fix something that had been broken for a long time. She had told him it depended on what he was willing to do about it. He'd revised his will 4 months later. The judge, a woman named Honorable Delphine Carter, asked Prescott if he wished to cross-examine. Prescott asked several questions that went nowhere because Dr. Wendell had 14 months of notes and a memory like a locked cabinet. Then Fletcher rose. He entered into evidence the independent will documents, the physician competency evaluation, Dina Park's intake notes, and one final item, a voicemail, 11 seconds long. My father's voice, which I had not heard in a recording before, which was strange and too familiar at the same time, leaving a message for Mr. Dorr, Aldridge, his family attorney, not Fletcher's firm, but the other one, Sylvia's firm, saying, I need you to understand that I have made separate arrangements for the Brevard property and that this is my clear and final intention. I would appreciate you noting this in the file. Aldridge had not noted in the file. Aldridge, sitting in the gallery, shifted in his seat. Prescott objected. Judge Carter overruled. When Fletcher sat back down, he didn't look at me. He was already writing something on his legal pad. I looked at Sylvia. She was staring at the wall above the judge's head. Her jaw was set, her pearls straight. Her expression, the particular kind of still that comes from a person who has realized the ground is moving under them, but refuses to acknowledge it in public. Bryce, for the first time, looked at me. His expression was something I didn't have a name for. Not guilt, not quite apology. Something more like recognition. The ruling came at the end of that day. Judge Carter found no credible evidence of compromised testamentary capacity. She found the independent documentation of my father's intent to be clear and consistent. She dismissed the contest with a finding that the challenge had been brought without substantial basis, and she awarded me attorney's fees. She used the word substantial. Prescott wrote something on his notepad very fast. I walked out of that courthouse into the October afternoon, and Yvonne was right behind me, and she grabbed my arm and said, Cass. Just that, just my name. Like it meant something, which I guess it did. That night I drove to Brevard. I don't know exactly why. It was 2 hours from Asheville, longer than it needed to be, and I arrived after dark. I parked on the gravel pull-off where my father had always parked, the one with the rusted gate and the hand-painted sign that said, Private, which had been there since before I was born. I climbed over the gate the way you do when the land is yours, and you don't have the key yet. I walked in the dark down the path I half remembered. The creek was audible before I could see it. That sound, water over rocks, the particular low rush of it, hit me somewhere below the sternum. I stopped walking and just stood there in the dark, listening, until my eyes adjusted to what little light there was. The land smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt and something older than I had words for. I didn't cry then either. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes and breathed. On the way back to my car, my foot found a root in the dark and I went down hard on my knee, ripping a hole in my good pants. And I sat there on the ground for a second and laughed. Just laughed, alone in the dark on my grandfather's land with dirty hands and a torn knee, because sometimes that is the only appropriate response. Sylvia sent a message through her attorney the following week. Not an apology. A request to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding the property. I had Fletcher respond that I was not interested in arrangements and would be retaining the land in its entirety. She did not reply. Bryce texted me directly from his own phone 3 weeks after the ruling. It was short, it said. I knew he meant it. I should have said so before. I'm sorry I didn't. I read it 4 times. Then I wrote back, I know. And I left it there. It is a strange thing to win something and still feel the shape of everything it cost. The land is mine now. 42 acres. The creek. The remains of the old cabin foundation, which I walked to on a Sunday in November with a thermos of coffee and stood in for a long time, imagining what it looked like when my great-grandfather built it, what it looked like when my father was 8 years old, and the water was so cold it felt like being held by something ancient. I have started taking weekend trips out there. I bring my coffee and my boots, and sometimes Yvonne, who complains about the mud but keeps coming back. We have talked about what to do with it, not develop it. That was never a question for me, but restore it. There is a conservation easement program through the North Carolina Land Trust that would protect the acreage permanently while allowing me to keep ownership. I have a meeting with them next month. My father could have told me about this land. He could have told me many things, and he didn't for reasons I will never fully understand, but he drove himself to an attorney's office in Brevard at 71 years old, with lymphoma in his lymph nodes, and had the papers drawn up in my name, and he did it independently, carefully, quietly, in the way of a man who knows that love is sometimes only legible in its actions and not its words. I think about that scholarship letter. I think about the Christmases. I think about his hand in mine, weaker than I expected, and the way he said, "You look like your mother," when I walked into his sunroom, and the creek, always the creek. I don't know what to do with all of it. I'm not sure I'm supposed to know. What I know is this. I'm 31 years old and I'm a nurse, and I own 42 acres in the mountains of western North Carolina that have been in my family since before my grandmother was born. I work 12-hour shifts and I drive with the windows down because the air conditioning is still broken and I keep meaning to fix it. I planted a red maple sapling on the land last month, not as a monument to anything, just because it was the right time of year, and the soil was ready and maples do well in that elevation. I'm going back next weekend to check on it. I keep thinking about the moment Mr. Aldridge shifted in his seat. That small, involuntary movement when the voicemail played. 11 seconds of my father's voice, careful and clear, and a man who had supposedly been acting in good faith suddenly couldn't find a comfortable position in his chair. That's how it works, I think, not with thunder. With 11 seconds, with a hospice intake note written by a woman who simply did her job and wrote everything down. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry, and the honest answer is that I was for a long time, carrying around something that felt like a low-grade fever I couldn't shake. The scholarship letter. The empty chair at Thanksgiving. The phone call that came after my father was already gone. Anger is the right response to those things. I don't think I was wrong to feel it. But I've learned, slowly and not always gracefully, that anger is only useful when it points you somewhere. When it just sits in you and burns, it doesn't hurt the people who caused it. It only hurts you. What I had to figure out, and it took me longer than I would like to admit, was the difference between giving up and letting go. Sylvia wanted me to give up. She counted on me not being able to afford the fight, not being able to organize my evidence, not being able to hold myself together in a room where someone called me unstable out loud while I was sitting right there. That's a specific kind of cruelty, and it requires a specific kind of response, which is not matching it in kind, but being more prepared than they expected. More thorough. More clear-eyed. Fletcher didn't win that hearing on emotion. He won it on documentation. Dates and notes and a voicemail and a doctor who drove herself to a courthouse because she believed the record should reflect the truth. I think a lot about what it actually takes to do the right thing when it costs you something. Dr. Wendell didn't have to come. Dina didn't have to keep those notes with such care. Those were choices made by people with good judgment and the willingness to act on it, even when it would have been easier not to. I try to remember that when I'm on a long shift and something feels complicated, and the easier path is visible right there. The easier path is usually available. You choose the other one because of who you want to be when the shift is over. And the land. 42 acres that my great-grandfather cleared by hand, that my father fished in as a boy, that I walked into in the dark and stood beside the creek and listened to water moving over rocks. That land did not come to me because I was lucky, or because the universe decided to balance some cosmic ledger. It came to me because my father drove himself to an attorney's office while he was sick and made a decision, and because I had the stubbornness to show up in court with documentation instead of just grief. Both things were necessary, his courage and mine. The maple sapling I planted is doing fine. I checked on it last weekend. It's small still, which is appropriate. Some things take a long time to become what they're going to be. That's not a flaw. That's just how growth works.